Okay, let's dive into this incredible stack of sources you've shared with us today. It's a real deep dive into the history of the United States, taking us on a journey from, well, the very first human footsteps on this continent, all the way up through the early 2000s.
It really is quite a sweep of time. We're talking over 10,000 years covered here, then centuries of colonial history, building a nation, conflicts, huge social and economic shifts.
Yeah.
It's all distilled right here in the material you've provided.
Exactly. And our mission today really is to cut through the density, pull out the most important nuggets, the insights that emerge from these specific sources, find those connections between different eras, and hopefully deliver a few aha moments that help you understand how the U.S. got to where it is today. We'll be sticking strictly to what these sources tell us.
Think of us as your guides through this material. We'll explore the early exploration and settlement, the path to revolution, the really challenging task of building a new nation, periods of pretty aggressive expansion, intense conflicts, both internal and external, big economic booms and busts, massive social change, and of course, the ever-shifting political landscape, all based on these documents.
All right, let's unpack this history right from the beginning, according to the material you've given us.
Okay, so the sources start with that intriguing mystery of the first people in the Western Hemisphere. Who were they? How did they even arrive?
Yeah.
A theory presented here suggests ancient people crossed a land bridge, one that once connected Siberia and Alaska. It's submerged now under the Bering Strait. The sources speculate maybe curiosity drove them, or the search for food, a better climate, maybe even escaping persecution.
So thousands of years later, the sources show European powers reaching out for empire.
Yeah.
Spain was particularly active early on, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The material gives accounts of explorers like Hernando de Soto. His journey through the southeast from 1539 to 1542 sounds brutal based on this.
Brutal, yeah.
Then there's Francisco de Coronado leading an expedition out of Mexico in 1540, famously searching for those mythical 7 cities of Cibola, rumored to be paved with gold.
Right, the cities of gold.
And Juan Cabrillo explored the coast of California in 1542. Plus, Catholic priests established missions. The sources really emphasize Spain's great success in building this worldwide empire and gathering, well, a fabulous fortune, which apparently inspired other European nations to jump in.
And France wasn't far behind, according to this material.
That's right. In 1534, Jacques Cartier, he was commissioned to find a northwest passage to Asia. Didn't find it, but on several voyages, he claimed huge territories eastern Canada, land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi.
Wow.
Later, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec and Montreal, and the sources highlight the fur trade in the Great Lakes region really lucrative, a source of wealth, though it didn't actually draw many French settlers over. Champlain also forged a key alliance with the Huron people against the Iroquois, which is noted as important.
Then the English, sort of perched on their islands, they got involved too?
Yeah, John Cabot made early claims for England way back in 1497, but serious English interest, it seems, really took off under Queen Elizabeth III, a Protestant monarch. Initially, their focus was maybe more on disrupting Spanish power at sea.
Like pirates, almost.
Well, figures like John Hawkins and Francis Drake are sometimes called buccaneers here. They brought back impressive hauls of gold and silver from Spanish ships. The sources point out Elizabeth's kind of contradictory stance, officially disclaiming involvement, but also knighting Drake after his circumnavigation brought back a fortune.
Interesting. It wasn't just about gold and land, though. The sources also dig into those crucial early encounters with native populations and the first steps towards self-governance. The story of Opekingano is pretty dramatic.
It really is. Chief Powhatan's brother. As a young boy, the sources say he was kidnapped by the Spanish in 1559, sent to Spain, given a Spanish name, Don Luis de Velasco, intended to be an interpreter. But the sources say when he returned home in the 1570s, he totally renounced his Spanish ties, reclaimed his authority, and might have even been involved in killing the missionaries who came back with him. It's suggested he probably would have killed John Smith if Pocahontas hadn't stepped in.
Wow. That really highlights the clashing worlds.
Exactly, the complex and often violent nature of these early interactions.
And on the governance side, the material mentions the House of Burgesses in Virginia.
Yes, early efforts were made to meet regularly. By 1639, the sources note the king instructed the governor to summon the Burgesses yearly. This basically solidified what was already becoming practice, establishing an important precedent for representative assemblies meeting annually.
Now, you mentioned religious freedom as a key motivator for some settlers, especially from England.
Absolutely. After the Reformation and all the religious conflicts in Europe, persecution was common. In England, you had the established Anglican Church, but many Protestants felt it needed to be purified of Catholic influences.
Right.
Those were the Puritans. Then a more radical group, the Separatists, felt they had to break away entirely.
And those separatists are the ones we often call the Pilgrims.
That's them. They arrived at Plymouth, and the sources point out they were pretty fortunate to meet Squanto and Samoset, two Indians who spoke English.
Crucial help.
Absolutely crucial. They helped arrange peace with local tribes and taught the Pilgrims essential survival skills, how to grow corn, fish, hunt. Really vital for the colony's survival, according to this material.
And then the larger Puritan migration followed not long after.
Yep, led by John Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Company starting around 1629. Winthrop, troubled by the moral state of England, led what's called the Great Migration. In 1630 alone, over 1,000 people arrived on 17 ships settling Boston.
And Winthrop had that famous phrase.
He did. He famously told his followers they were to be, as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us. This idea was rooted in a covenant with God, a commitment to build a society based on biblical teachings. The sources emphasize these Puritan settlers were often well-educated and pretty well off financially.
Which helped them get established.
Definitely. Helped them in trade, commerce, farming, led to rapid growth for the colony.
So you see these really distinct motivations and structures leading to very different colonial developments. The sources highlight these variations, especially in the South, and how settlers there interacted with native peoples.
Yeah, the Carolina settlers, for instance. The sources say they frequently aided some tribes against others, but then kind of alarmingly regularly sold captured members of rival tribes into slavery.
Yeah, that's grim.
It is. The sources are quite stark, stating that before long, these settlers had either, quote, exterminated or enslaved the Indians in the Carolinas or reduced them to a state of total dependence. It's a brutal outcome documented right here.
What about the Dutch colony in the middle? New Netherland.
Right. New Netherland or New Amsterdam, centered on that vital port at the foot of Manhattan Island. The English monarch, Charles II, and his brother James, they definitely had their eye on this port.
A strategic spot.
Hugely strategic. The sources suggest the Dutch hadn't attracted as many settlers, and the people in New Amsterdam didn't much care for their autocratic governors. One of them was Peter Stuyvesant, who arrived in 1647.
Stuyvesant, the one with the peg leg.
That's the one. The sources describe him visually, saying he looked like a peacock, all pomp and majesty, even with his decorated peg leg. Ruled with stern decrees, but apparently didn't win many friends.
And the southern colonies, with their big plantations, the sources describe a very specific social structure developing there.
They do. Cultivating cash crops like tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo, it required a massive workforce. Initially, they relied heavily on indentured servants. Then, in 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia with 20 Africans.
And their status was unclear at first.
That's what the sources say, unclear initially, but slavery soon became deeply institutionalized. By 1700, a distinct master class had emerged, holding life and death power over a slave class who had, quote, no rights. Families could be arbitrarily broken up by sales. And those who committed crimes against slaves, even killings, the sources say they invariably escaped punishment. There was a small middle class, mostly in the cities.
Meanwhile, up north, particularly Boston, the sources describe a different kind of class emerging.
Yeah, a mercantile class. They built wealth by transporting goods, furs, naval stores, fish. They also engaged in what the sources call triangular trade.
Explain that a bit based on the sources.
Okay, so it involved shipping lumber and furs to the West Indies for molasses. That molasses was distilled into rum back in New England. Then the rum, along with other goods, might go to England or Europe or sometimes sail to Africa to trade for enslaved people who were then transported to the southern colonies.
And they often ignored British trade laws.
The sources point out they often violated the Navigation Acts, but these merchants were evidently pretty skilled at finding ways around those restrictions.
Religion continued to be a big factor, both for community and causing dissent, right?
Definitely. In places like Pennsylvania, dominated by Quakers, issues came up because Quakers refused to take oaths. That caused legal problems, complicated pledges of allegiance.
And their pacifism created conflicts too.
Yeah, especially in dealing with Native American populations. Over time, the sources note, Quaker political control in Pennsylvania faded.
And then the mid-18th century saw this major religious revival sweep through the colonies.
The First Great Awakening, starting around the 1720s, it affected all classes, all regions. Ministers like Jonathan Edwards, Theodorus Frelinghuysen were important, but the sources give special attention to George Whitefield.
He came from England.
Arrived from England in 1739, toured the colonies. The sources say he mesmerized huge audiences, sometimes up to 10,000 people hungry for salvation in places like Philadelphia. He played a huge role in regenerating this revivalistic fervor.
So you can see these incredibly diverse, sometimes conflicting foundations being laid, which takes us right into the period where grievances started building up, pushing towards independence.
Exactly. And this brings us to that long-running rivalry between England and France. The sources describe it as 100 years of warfare, fought both in Europe and here in America.
They mention specific wars.
Yes, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War. In America, the French, under Governor Marquis Duquesne, were aggressively building forts west of the Appalachians and around the Great Lakes, trying to secure their control over that vast interior.
After these wars, the sources show a big shift in British policy towards the colonies. More direct control.
Yes, exactly. Moving towards direct taxation and regulation. The Sugar Act was an early example. Then a year later came the Quartering Act, which required colonies to provide housing and supplies for British troops stationed there.
And then came the Stamp Act. The material really presents this as a major turning point.
It really seems to be. This was the first direct tax levied by Parliament on the colonies. It required a tax stamp on all sorts of things: newspapers, legal documents, contracts, even playing cards. The sources state this created quite an uproar, especially hitting the legal profession hard.
And the colonial response was quick and organized.
James Otis in Massachusetts proposed a meeting of delegates from all the colonies. This led to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City, October 1765. Delegates from most colonies came. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, mostly written by John Dickinson.
What was the core argument?
They insisted only their own elected legislatures could tax them. Parliament didn't represent them. And the sources famously quote their declaration: taxation without representation, they declare, was nothing less than tyranny. That became a real rallying cry.
And tensions just kept escalating after that, based on the sources.
They did. The material highlights Thomas Jefferson's pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America, from August 1774. Jefferson defended things like the Boston Tea Party as actions of a desperate people. The sources note this pamphlet was so effective it made Jefferson a leading spokesman for colonial rights almost overnight.
Meanwhile, the British government, under King George, was digging in its heels.
General Thomas Gage replaced Hutchinson as governor of Massachusetts, bringing 4,000 soldiers with him. And the sources quote King George's determined stance: the die is cast. The colonists must either triumph or submit.
The colonists chose not to submit, leading to the First Continental Congress.
Convened in Philadelphia, September 1774, delegates from all colonies except Georgia. You had radicals like Sam and John Adams, Patrick Henry, but also moderates like Joseph Galloway, whose compromise plan was rejected.
So what did they agree on?
They adopted a declaration, mainly written by John Adams, firmly stating colonial rights to life, liberty, and property, and condemning recent British acts as unconstitutional, dangerous. The sources point out they deliberately used the word Congress, asserting their status as, in their view, separate, individual, and sovereign states.
And as the politics heated up, open violence became unavoidable.
Yes, leading to the first armed clashes. The Battle of Bunker Hill, though apparently misnamed, is described in the sources as one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Yeah, a striking detail here. 1/8 of all British officers killed in the whole Revolutionary War died in this one battle. General Henry Clinton, who had just arrived, is quoted saying, "Another such victory would have ruined us. Really shows the cost, even for a British win."
So with war underway, the Second Continental Congress gathered.
In May 1775, building on the first, this Congress moved towards more radical steps. They raised an army, appointed George Washington commander, issued currency, even started negotiating with foreign powers for help.
And that foreign help, especially from France, was crucial for victory, right?
Absolutely critical. The call for French help was answered by Admiral François de Grasse, arriving with a fleet of 20 warships and 7,000 men. This combined Franco-American force, 16,000 strong under Washington, surrounded the British under Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1781. De Grasse's fleet blocked any escape by sea.
Trapped.
Completely trapped. Cornwallis had to surrender his army of 8,000 regulars and sailors.
And the sources describe that as basically ending the war.
Pretty much, yeah, for practical purposes. Back in London, the House of Commons voted to end the war and authorize peace talks. The Treaty of Paris was signed provisionally on November 30th, 1782. Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, Henry Lawrence for the U.S. Congress ratified it in April 1783.
What were the key terms of that treaty, according to the sources?
Several important points are listed. U.S. independence recognized, obviously. Boundaries set. Atlantic to the Mississippi, north to the Great Lakes. The sources specifically mentioned Franklin failed to get Canada, which he wanted.
Interesting.
Also, end of hostilities, British evacuation, American fishing rights off Newfoundland, and restoration of rights and property for loyalists. The sources call it a very generous treaty for the U.S. Apparently the French weren't happy, they weren't consulted more, but Franklin smoothed things over.
A generous end to a tough war. Now comes the huge challenge described in the sources. Building a nation, basically from scratch, under a new government. The Constitutional Convention was the starting point for that structure.
It was. The sources talk about the compromises made, which were then given to a committee of detail to draft. The final document set terms. Representatives 2 years, senators 6, president 4. It specifically forbade states from issuing paper money or interfering with contracts, big problems under the Articles of Confederation.
And presidential powers.
It detailed congressional powers, but was, interestingly, less specific about the executive and judiciary, suggesting Congress would fill those details in later. But it did outline how the president would be elected, how justices appointed, gave the president the veto, appointment power, commander-in-chief role, and mandated a Supreme Court.
So they built the frame, but the sources stress adding specific rights was critical to the Bill of Rights.
James Madison was really insistent on this. The House eventually agreed on 17 amendments, most focused on protecting personal liberties, speech, press, religion, assembly, petition, bearing arms, fair trial guarantees. And crucially, the sources highlight the 10th Amendment.
What does that say again?
It explicitly states that any powers not specifically given to the national government are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Really important for that balance of power.
Building the government was one thing. Testing its authority was another. The sources mention an early challenge.
That came from Alexander Hamilton's excise tax on distilled liquor, passed in 1791 to help manage the new government's debt. Farmers in western Pennsylvania, where whiskey was a major product, resisted this tax. They attacked federal revenue officers,
Which led to the Whiskey Rebellion.
In 1794, President Washington decided to show the federal government's muscle. He sent about 13,000 militiamen to crush the uprising. The sources say the rebellion just quickly evaporated when the troops arrived.
Any consequences for the rebels?
Individuals were tried for treason, but Washington eventually pardoned them. The key takeaway emphasized here is that this action had the excellent effect of reaffirming the authority of the central government, showed it could and would enforce its laws.
The young nation also immediately faced foreign policy hurdles.
The sources describe a conflict with France starting in 1797. French ministers in Paris tried to extort a bribe, $240,000 from U.S. diplomats just for diplomatic recognition.
Wow. How did the U.S. respond?
The response, quoted here, was firm. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. This led to an undeclared naval conflict from 1798 to 1800, sometimes called the Quasi-War. President Adams tried to keep the peace, but Congress authorized a Navy department, built ships, expanded the army. This war hysteria also hurt the Republican Party, seen as pro-French.
Moving into the early 1800s, administrations changed, and trade policies with Britain and France became a major headache.
Jefferson's presidency brought some changes, like judicial adjustments with the Judiciary Act of 1802, reestablished a 6-member Supreme Court, created new circuit courts. He also tried, though failed, to remove political justices through impeachment.
But trade policy under Jefferson and then Madison was a constant struggle, wasn't it? With Britain and France at war.
Yeah, a real mess. The sources describe attempts like the Embargo Act tried, failed, repealed, replaced by the Non-Importation Act in 1809, reopening trade except with France and England. When Madison took over, similar problems. Congress passed Macon's Bill No. 2, removed restrictions, but let the president reimpose them on one side if the other lifted its decrees.
And Napoleon took advantage.
He did. Falsely announced he'd revoke his decrees. Madison believed him, closed trade with Britain. The sources say Madison soon realized he'd been hoodwinked. Britain then ramped up impressment, seizing American sailors.
through all this, the sources note a shift in the American character, something observable.
Yeah, foreign observers at the time, quoted here, remarked on a growing focus on building a materialistic society, deeply invested in business, trade, getting wealthy. Money seemed key. The spirit of the age, according to these travelers, was just, go ahead, go ahead.
Sounds energetic, if maybe a bit chaotic.
One visitor commented, the whole continent presents a scene of scrambling and roars with greedy hurry. Even Senator Daniel Webster agreed, describing, our age is full of excitement and rapid, constant change.
That go-ahead spirit seems like a perfect segue into the next major era in the sources, the Jacksonian Age, marked by expanding democracy, aggressive expansion, and, well, lots of disagreement.
It certainly fits. Expansion continued, sometimes very aggressively, as documented here. Andrew Jackson's actions in Florida in 1818 are a key example. Seminoles were attacking U.S. settlements from Spanish Florida, then retreating back across the border.
So Monroe sent Jackson to stop them.
Monroe, via Secretary of War Calhoun, instructed Jackson to stop the invasions, authorizing him to cross the border if needed. But Jackson, described here as a very aggressive general, decided on a more productive course. He asked permission to seize Florida entirely, believing it was the only way to end the problem.
And did he get permission? Or just act?
The sources say he believed he got permission from Monroe. He then slammed across the Florida border, killed Seminole fighters, burned towns. He also controversially captured and executed 2 British nationals, Arbuthnot and Ambrister, accusing them of aiding the Indians. Finally, he captured the Spanish centers of St. Mark's and Pensacola and turned them over to the U.S.
This constant push west often clashed directly with the slavery issue, notably in the Missouri Compromise.
In 1820, the sources describe a tense political fight. The House initially rejected one bill admitting Missouri, slave, and Maine, free, and restricting slavery north of the 36-degree 30-minute line in the Louisiana Territory. But, the sources say, it miraculously passed when split into 3 separate measures doing basically the same thing.
Why did Southerners agree to the northern restriction?
They accepted it because they thought slavery wouldn't work there anyway, and they believed they could take slaves into the western and southern territories. There's a telling quote here from Representative William Plumer claiming Southerners frightened our weak-minded members into an abandonment of their stand against slavery.
This era also saw the U.S. defining its foreign policy stance more clearly, especially with the Monroe Doctrine.
That's right, 1823, aimed at European powers. 2 main points. U.S. won't interfere with existing European colonies or independent nations in the Western Hemisphere, and crucially, European powers must not interfere in the Western Hemisphere. Basically declared the Americas off-limits to further European colonization or meddling.
And John Quincy Adams added another significant perspective on foreign policy.
His 4th of July oration in 1821. He said the U.S. would always be a well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, but warned the nation must not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy.
What was his reasoning?
He cautioned that doing so would start America seeking dominion and power and eventually lead to losing its own freedom and independence. It raises a good question for you to think about how well has that principle held up based on later owns in these sources.
Politically, the sources describe a noticeable shift in style around the 1824 election. Less aristocratic.
Yeah, compared to Washington's inauguration powdered wig, knee breeches, the 1824 candidates wore trousers, shirts, neckties. Andrew Jackson, though, from the upper class, cultivated this image of an ordinary citizen, a Democrat. The other main candidates were Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, and John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, seen as a stepping stone presidency.
Jackson was popular, but lacked Adams's or Clay's experience.
True. In 1824, he got the most popular votes and electoral votes, but not a majority. So, House decided, under the 12th Amendment, Clay threw his support to Adams, making Adams president.
And Jackson's inauguration reception in 1829 became legendary for its chaos, really illustrating this new Democratic energy.
The sources paint a vivid picture, a mob scene at the White House. Guests grabbing food, smashing glass and china. Punch tubs had to be moved outside to lure the crowd out. Men supposedly dove through windows, kids fought over ice cream, women fainted. One congressman called it a regular Saturnalia, a striking image of the changing political culture.
The Jacksonian era saw major conflicts. Indian removal is a particularly tragic one documented here.
The sources focus on the Cherokee, described as a civilized tribe, and their fight against Georgia. Georgia passed laws banning white men in Cherokee territory without state permission. 2 missionaries, Samuel Worcester and Elizur Butler, refused to leave and were jailed.
They sued, right?
Yes, in Worcester v. Georgia. The Supreme Court ruled against Georgia, saying the state had no jurisdiction there. But President Jackson basically ignored the court. He pressured Georgia's governor to free the missionaries while also pushing the Cherokee to move west. Eventually, a removal treaty, the Treaty of New Echota, was approved through what the sources call fraud and chicanery. The tribe was then rounded up, held in stockades, and forced west.
And the sources give details of that journey, the Trail of Tears.
Yes, an 800-mile journey. The sources document immense suffering, sickness, misery, death. Out of about 18,000 Cherokee removed, 4,000 died. A profoundly tragic event detailed right here.
Jackson also faced the nullification crisis, testing federal power again.
South Carolina declared the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void within its borders. Jackson threatened military force to collect them. Vice President Calhoun, a South Carolinian, resigned as VP and got elected to the Senate to fight Jackson.
How was it resolved?
Henry Clay brokered the compromise tariff of 1833. It lowered rates gradually over 10 years, a truce. Jackson signed both the compromise tariff and a force bill, giving him authority to use the military. South Carolina backed down without bloodshed.
And then, the famous Bank War.
The charter for the Second Bank of the United States was expiring. A bill to recharter it passed Congress in 1832. Jackson vetoed it July 10, 1832. The sources call this one of the most important presidential vetoes ever.
Why so important?
Because Jackson's reasons went beyond just constitutionality. He hit it on political, economic, social grounds, argued it was a harmful monopoly, interfered in elections, benefited rich foreign investors. He even challenged the Supreme Court's earlier ruling upholding the bank, McCulloch v. Maryland. Jackson insisted the president and Congress had to follow their own view of the Constitution, saying the court's authority only had influence as the force of their reasoning may deserve.
Strong words. And he acted against the bank directly.
He ordered federal funds removed from the BUS, putting them in state banks. Opponents called them pet banks. Nicholas Biddle, the bank's head, retaliated by cutting loans, deliberately causing a sharp recession in late 1833, early 1834. The sources quote Biddle. This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken.
Jackson's stance, claiming to represent the people, drew sharp criticism too.
Senator Daniel Webster strongly denounced it. The sources quote Webster calling it a mere assumption and dangerous assumption. If Jackson is the sole representative of the American people, Webster argued, then the government has already a master.
And out of all this opposition to Jackson, a new political party formed.
The Whig Party, a mix of groups opposing Jackson, Old Federalists, National Republicans, some nullifiers. They called themselves Whigs, like the British opposition to the king, and called Jackson King Andrew, vowing to undo his policies.
The Jacksonian era wound down with economic problems and a famously boisterous election.
The Panic of 1837, a bad depression, helped defeat Jackson's successor, Van Buren, in 1840. William Henry Harrison and John Tyler won in what the sources call a rollicking campaign. Songs, parades, hard cider, coonskin hats, the Tippecanoe and Tyler II campaign.
But some Whigs were uneasy about that style.
Yeah, some worried it reflected democracy run wild, leading to mindless buffoonery.
Alongside politics, the sources highlight major cultural and intellectual movements then.
Transcendentalism gets mentioned in George Ripley's meetings. The Brook Farm communal living experiment near Boston attracted visitors, though it ended after a fire in 1847.
This period is also described as a real flowering of American literature.
It certainly was. Nathaniel Hawthorne used transcendentalist ideas. Henry Thoreau, friend of Emerson and other key transcendentalists, spent time at Walden Pond. His book, Walden Explored His Philosophy, Nature, includes that famous quote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately."
Right.
And his essay, Civil Disobedience, written after he was jailed for refusing to pay a tax for a war he opposed, had an enormous influence later on Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., a lasting global impact.
Education reform also took steps forward.
Horace Mann was a key figure. Textbooks improved, building on Noah Webster's work. William H. McGuffey's Eclectic Reader, first published 1836, is highlighted, had an immediate and tremendous impact on elementary schools. Emphasized cultural, moral standards, patriotism.
McGuffey's influence was seen as huge.
The sources make a striking claim. He had a greater influence on American life than any other writer or politician of the age. Quite something.
Finally, The sources touch on the ever-present issue of slavery and the fear of resistance back then.
Yeah, there was deep, lingering fear of slave revolts, especially after things like Denmark Vesey's planned revolt in Charleston in 1822. Vesey, a free mulatto, led followers whites exaggerate the numbers. It was brutally suppressed, 35 hanged, 37 banished. That fear lingered in the minds of Southerners, the sources say. While the right to petition Congress about slavery held up, the basic problem remained, and the sources end this section saying the Union itself was hanging in the balance.
That precarious balance leads us right into the intense fight over slavery, secession, and the Civil War.
And the sources show expansion kept pouring fuel on that fire. John Tyler, who became president after Harrison died, went back to his Democratic roots. Vetoed Whig laws, pushed hard for Texas annexation. This drive west, the sources explain, led to this new idea from editor John L. O'Sullivan, manifest destiny.
The famous phrase.
His essay declared it was the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent. The sources link this back to Andrew Jackson's earlier views, expansion for security, belief that God intended the Great Valley for one nation. Jackson even wanted all Spanish North America.
Acquiring all that land from Mexico after the war brought the slavery question right to the forefront, didn't it?
Especially with the Wilmot Proviso. This proposal aimed to ban slavery in any territory won from Mexico. Passed the House, failed the Senate. The sources quote the Boston Whig saying the proviso brought to a head the great question which is about to divide the American people. Millions of new acres meant the issue couldn't be dodged anymore.
This division showed up starkly in the politics, like the 1848 election.
President Polk didn't run again. Democrats nominated Lewis Cass, who favored popular sovereignty, let the settlers decide on slavery locally. But the slavery issue split the Democrats. Some broke off, joined with abolitionists from the Liberty Party, formed the Free Soil Party, nominated Martin Van Buren. Their platform was clear. Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. The Whigs nominated another general, Zachary Taylor.
And then the California Gold Rush just threw gasoline on the fire.
Starting 1849, the 49ers rushed into California. Population exploded 6,000 to over 85,000 in just a year. When delegates wrote a constitution in September 49, they banned slavery and demanded statehood, not just territory status. Boom, slavery question back, urgent.
When Congress met that December, the sources say the tension was incredibly high.
Yeah, described as a session full of North-South accusations. Representative Robert Toombs of Georgia, called a stormy petrel for stirring things up, is quoted shouting his threat. Said if Southerners were driven from territories faced national degradation, he was for disunion, would give everything to achieve it.
Wow. Adding to this north-south divergence was rapid industrial growth and immigration, mainly in the north.
After the Panic of 1837 recovery, manufacturing really took off. Immigration, especially Irish and Germans fleeing famine and political upheaval, provided labor. Sources note over 1.3 million industrial workers. Big tech shifts, too. Switch to coal power, steam power transforming transport steamboats, railroads booming 30,000 miles by the 1850s, connecting Midwest and East. Machine tool industry developed, too.
To really get the conflict, it's vital to understand slavery as an institution, as the sources describe it.
The sources are very clear. Enslaved people were property, chattel, bought and sold. Families, husbands, wives, parents, children could be broken up forever. An enslaved person had no rights. Killing a slave was technically a crime, but the sources say perpetrators invariably escaped punishment. Couldn't go to court, couldn't testify against whites, depended on the owner's goodwill. Relationships varied, sometimes called paternalistic, but the power imbalance was absolute.
The sources also detail the different kinds of southern plantations, the economic engine of slavery.
5 main types listed. Short fiber cotton spread west after 1812, made cotton king central to the economy. Tobacco, the oldest in the Chesapeake, spread west. Rice, very capital intensive, in coastal swamps, southern Louisiana. Sugar, mostly Louisiana, also capital intensive, combined farming and manufacturing. Smallest was hemp, Kentucky, Missouri, also needed enslaved labor.
These rising tensions didn't stay just political talk. They erupted into violence before the war fully broke out.
Most famously in Kansas, bleeding Kansas. Violence between free state and pro-slavery settlers became a local civil war. An investigation found fair elections were impossible there without major reforms.
And the violence even reached the Senate floor itself.
May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a fiery speech, The Crime Against Kansas, attacked pro-slavery forces as hirelings, specifically attacked Senator Andrew Pickens Butler of South Carolina. Days later, Representative Preston Brooks, Butler's cousin, brutally attacked Sumner right there in the Senate chamber, beating him severely with a cane. An attack in Congress itself showed how far things had broken down.
All this tension boiled over in the critical election of 1860.
This election really showed the nation's deep splits. The Democrats fractured Stephen Douglas for the North, John Breckinridge for the South. Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. Sources note William Seward was a frontrunner until his irrepressible conflict speech scared people off. Lincoln's House divided speech seemed more unifying, though still clear on the conflict. Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin won. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, old Whigs, know-nothings, nominated Bell and Everett.
Lincoln won, but without a popular majority, and his victory immediately sparked secession.
Southern states started leaving the Union, South Carolina first. February 1861, they formed the Confederate States of America, adopted a constitution like the U.S. one, but stressed state sovereignty and explicitly protected slavery. Jefferson Davis elected provisional president, Alexander Stephens VP.
Were there any final attempts at peace described in the sources?
Yes, a few. A peace convention met in Washington, February 1861, led by former President John Tyler, but it failed. Congress even considered a constitutional amendment to guarantee slavery where it existed. It actually passed the House and Senate, but failed state ratification, partly due to opposition from Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens.
But those efforts failed, plunging the nation into the crucible of the Civil War.
The sources start the war narrative with early Union moves, pressure for a quick strike on Richmond. Lincoln overruled General Winfield Scott, who wanted more training time wisely, it turned out. General Irwin McDowell led the main Union force at First Bull Run, or Manassas Junction, July 1861.
And that battle didn't go well for the Union, according to the sources.
Started okay, but Confederate reinforcements arrived, routed the Union troops, panic, fled back to Washington. This is where General Thomas J. Jackson got his nickname, Stonewall. Sources note that after this, Lincoln realized Scott was right about training. George B. McClellan replaced McDowell.
Congress also took major wartime actions to support the effort.
January 1863, they authorized recruiting up to 150,000 black soldiers, a significant step. March 1863, the Conscription Act passed, a draft for men 20-45. But controversially, you could get out by paying $300 or hiring a substitute.
That draft caused major problems, didn't it?
It did. Most dramatically, the draft riots in New York City, mid-July 1863. The sources point out this violence actually masked a race riot, highlighting those deep underlying tensions even within the Union.
Throughout the war, Lincoln offered a powerful vision for its purpose.
The sources mention his vision for a new birth of freedom for the nation, a purpose that deepened as the war went on.
And key Union victories helped advance that vision.
Wins like Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge near Chattanooga in late '63 were crucial. Routed Confederates there opened a vital path through Georgia towards the sea, set the stage for later campaigns like Sherman's March.
As the war ground on, Lincoln also started planning for reunification reconstruction.
He issued the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, December 1863, a relatively mild plan. Said when 10% of 1860 voters in a seceded state took a loyalty oath, they could form a new state government without slavery and rejoin. Sources note radical Republicans in Congress hated this plan. They thought Congress, not the president, should control restoring the South.
The war itself continued as a brutal grind, especially in the East under General Grant.
Grant was promoted to lieutenant general, given supreme command, took direct command of the Army of the Potomac, over 100,000 men. May 1864, launched his wilderness campaign against Lee's 60,000, aiming to just constantly attack and wear down Lee's army.
The sources mention terrible losses.
Horrendous slaughter at places like Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. Grant lost nearly 60,000 men, Lee maybe half that. But the key point in the sources, the Confederates couldn't replace their losses like the Union could. Lee's army was bleeding to death. Grant then swung south, laid siege to Petersburg, the rail hub for Richmond, starting June '64. That siege lasted 9 months.
Lincoln's vision for the end, for reconciliation, was powerfully stated in his second inaugural address.
March 1865, just before the end. The sources quote those famous words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace."
And the fighting finally ended soon after.
Grant kept pushing Lee in Virginia. Lee had to retreat from Petersburg and Richmond, hoping to link up with General Johnston in North Carolina. Grant blocked his path. April 7th, 1865, Grant asked for Lee's surrender. Lee's army, down to maybe 30,000, surrounded, had no choice. The two generals met at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee surrendered to Grant, April 9th, 1865.
The war over. An immense struggle detailed in your sources. But the aftermath, Reconstruction, brought new battles, leading into the era often called the Gilded Age.
Yes, after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson became president, and the sources describe immediate conflict with Congress. Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, aimed at protecting freedmen's rights.
And Congress pushed back.
They did. Congress overrode his veto. The sources highlight this. The first major piece of legislation in U.S. history enacted over a presidential objection. Moderates were appalled by Johnson. The New York Herald called his veto a declaration of war. Senator Trumbull is quoted, outraged the president wouldn't protect freedmen's liberty and property.
Radical Republicans in Congress had a much different idea about rebuilding the South than Johnson did.
Figures like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, they wanted a more thorough job. Sources describe them wanting to rebuild what they destroyed, remove the rubbish, build from the bottom, using the strong arm of power from the federal government to ensure real change.
And their vision led to major laws, despite Johnson.
The Military Reconstruction Act, introduced by Stevens, passed early 1867, divided the South into 5 military districts. Federal commanders could declare martial law, protect black citizens, oversee state restoration, required new state conventions elected by black men and loyal whites that had to guarantee black suffrage and ratify the 14th Amendment. Johnson vetoed it. Congress overrode him again.
The Gilded Age that followed Reconstruction was also known for politics and scandal, according to your sources.
Election of 1872, Ulysses S. Grant re-elected. Opposition liberal Republicans, Democrats nominated Horace Greeley, called a feeble candidate here, who actually died soon after the election. Republicans benefited from waving the bloody shirt, linking opponents to the rebellion.
And the credit mobilier scandal was a big one mentioned.
Came to light after the election. Investigation followed. Sources detail Congressman Oaks Ames being accused of bribing members. He denied it, said he just sold them stock cheap as an investment. But the committee found him guilty of selling shares below the true value with intent thereby to influence votes. Recommended his expulsion. Sources don't say if he actually was expelled, though.
These scandals, ties between Congress and big business, they contributed to economic problems.
Didn't help confidence. The Panic of 1873 hit hard, triggered a depression lasting until 1879. Sources say it was caused by wild speculation, especially railroads, dishonest banking, overexpansion, failure of Jay Cooke and Company, caused widespread suffering, 3 million jobs lost, market collapse, banks closed, farm prices fell, railroads defaulted.
The sources also describe a really controversial election in 1876 that effectively ended Reconstruction.
Tilden, Democrat versus Hayes, Republican. Disputed votes in several states created a crisis. An electoral commission was set up February 1877. Controversially, voted 8-7 along party lines to give all disputed votes to Hayes, making him president.
How was that resolved? It sounds explosive.
Democrats in the House threatened to filibuster the count. With inauguration looming, a backroom deal was struck. Southern congressmen were lobbied with promises from Hayes' side: withdraw federal troops from the South, appoint a Southerner to the cabinet, give patronage, fund Southern rebuilding. Hayes became president, the troops left, and federal protection for black civil rights in the South effectively ended.
And the withdrawal of troops quickly led to the rollback of Reconstruction gains.
Yes, Southern states started passing discriminatory Jim Crow laws. Tennessee first in 1881, segregating railroads. Florida, Texas, Louisiana followed. Challenges went to the Supreme Court, which in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, upheld segregation under the separate but equal doctrine as long as equal accommodations existed.
Beyond politics, this era saw the rise of huge businesses and their massive influence on government.
Monopolies, trusts formed to kill competition. Standard Oil, 1882, controlling 90% of the market, is a key example. Investment bankers consolidated whole industries. Sources use the term robber barons for some, noting they used money to control legislators, legislation. Lobbyists, journalists, former congressmen, even widows' daughters of former congressmen described as hovering around the Capitol like birds of prey.
Tariff debates were also huge political fights then.
The 1888 election is an example. Harrison won the electoral vote over Cleveland's popular vote, largely divided on tariffs. Republicans high, Democrats low. Thomas Brackett Reed, Czar Reed, controlled the House, pushed through the McKinley Tariff Act, raised duties significantly, 49.5%. Western senators fought it without a silver coinage bill. Southern senators opposed a force bill protecting black voters. Both passed. McKinley tariffs signed October 1890. Prices went up, seen as a tax on the poor for rich industries. An interesting provision noted, President could raise duties for reciprocal deals without Congress's okay Congress giving up power over taxes spending.
Economic troubles came back later in the 1890s.
The Panic of 1893. Gold reserves hemorrhaging. President Cleveland called a special session, asked Congress to repeal the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, blaming it. Congress did, quickly, but the gold drain and depression got worse. Coxey's Army unemployed workers, led by Jacob Coxey, marched on Washington 1894, demanding jobs, more money supply. Coxeyan leaders arrested, Army disbanded.
And tariffs came up again with the Wilson-Gorman tariff.
1894. House lowered rates, Senate added 634 amendments, raising them back up. Cleveland refused to sign it. Became law anyway. It included an income tax, 2% on income over $4. But the Supreme Court, in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company, ruled it unconstitutional. Said it was a direct tax needing apportionment by population, which it wasn't.
So a nation grappling with boom and bust, corruption, massive industrial power. Moving into the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the sources show continued expansion, reform movements, and eventually getting pulled into global conflict.
The sources characterize U.S. progress then as miraculous, development as steady, unrelenting, including more territorial expansion beyond the continent.
Building on earlier gains like Louisiana, Florida, the Mexican Cession.
Right. Sources mention the Gadsden Purchase, 1853, $10 million called conscience money by some for land taken earlier. And 1867, William Seward bought Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. Mocked as Seward's folly initially, but sources note later gold, oil, gas finds more than justified it.
And expansion went across the Pacific, too.
To Hawaii, annexed 1898 by joint resolution. American ties there went back to the 1830s. Americans revolted 1893, deposed Queen Liliuokalani, set up their own government. Annexation faced anti-imperialist opposition in the U.S., but the islands were seen as key market, resources like pineapple, vital refueling naval bases for Pacific power. Framed by some as manifest destiny revisited, spreading freedom democracy. Hawaii became a territory in 1900.
This era also included the Spanish-American War. Short, but significant.
1898. Origins in Cuba's fight for independence, Spanish abuses, U.S. sympathy, sensational yellow press reporting. The USS Maine explosion in Havana Harbor really ignited demands for war. Congress recognized Cuban independence, demanded Spain leave, authorized force. Key part. The Teller Amendment, stating U.S. had no intention of annexing Cuba, would leave control to its people after peace. Spain broke relations, declared war April 24. U.S. declared war April 25.
Back home, a big push for change was happening in the progressive movement.
Rose up against abuses by corporations, machine politics we talked about, pushed for state reforms like Wisconsin under La Follette, railroad regulation, income tax. States adopted direct primary initiative, referendum, more voter power.
And writers were key in exposing the problems.
Called Muckrakers by Theodore Roosevelt, Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, David Graham Phillips. Used investigative journalism in popular magazines, Cosmopolitan, McClure's exposing corruption, greed. Roosevelt's nickname compared them to a character in Pilgrim's Progress focused only on filth.
This reform and expansion period eventually led the U.S. into World War I.
The 1916 election happened with Europe already at war. Democrats used the slogan, "He kept us out of war," for Wilson. Close race, Wilson reelected. U.S. tried to stay neutral. Wilson pushed for a new world order via his 14 points, though sources say this proved later learned to be impossible.
The U.S. even got briefly involved in the Russian Civil War.
Allies decided to intervene against the Bolsheviks. Wilson personally thought it wrong, counterproductive, but sources say he reluctantly agreed under Allied pressure.
Wilson also made a political mistake regarding Congress.
He asked voters in the 1918 midterms to return a Democratic Congress to show support for his leadership going into peace talks. Sources say this offended the electorate, who sent Republican majorities to both houses instead, undermined Wilson right when he needed strength. The war ended abruptly soon after, November 11th, 1918. German defeat. Kaiser abdicated.
After the huge strain of the war, the sources describe the era known as the Roaring Twenties.
Characterized by its jazz age culture, sources describe flappers, young women, short dress shares, smoked cigarettes, a new version of the American woman feeling freedom after getting the vote.
Also a time of great creativity in arts and literature.
Absolutely. Sources highlight bold new styles, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Dreiser, who finished developing naturalism. Eugene O'Neill basically created American theater tradition. Poets like Eliot, Pound, Frost, Sandburg. The Harlem Renaissance, vibrant celebration of Black culture. Hughes, Dubois, exploring joy and pain. Painting like Georgia O'Keeffe, Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie-style architecture gained notice.
Technology was changing society rapidly, too.
Radio became instantly popular. New mass medium. Led to the Federal Radio Commission to license, regulate. Later became the FCC, adding TV.
Politically, the 20s were dominated by Republicans.
1924 election, a stunning victory for Coolidge and Republicans took both houses. 1928, Hoover won big over Al Smith, promising farm relief. Sources also note 1928 saw the first African-American from outside the South in Congress, Oscar S. Priest of Illinois. Served with distinction, but still forced to eat in the Capitol basement due to segregation.
The optimism of the 20s crashed hard, leading into hard times and another global conflict. The Great Depression, New Deal, World War II.
The 1929 crash started the Great Depression. Unemployment soared, widespread poverty, soup kitchens, begging, profound loss of confidence in business, government.
Investigations after the crash revealed problems in finance.
Sources mention evidence bankers misused funds, manipulated markets, investment bankers seen as villains. Hoover got blamed for failing to end it.
And his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, advised just waiting it out.
Mellon believed the business cycle would fix it. Sources quote his stark view. Let the slump liquidate itself. Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers. Made the Hoover administration even more disliked as things worsened.
Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in '32 brought the New Deal response.
His first Congress, the 100 Days, passed tons of measures quickly. Emergency Relief Act, Soil Conservation Act, Rural Electrification Administration, National Youth Administration, many others trying to fix the crisis.
A key piece of New Deal legislation was Social Security.
Passed August 1935. Set up federal state unemployment compensation and old age pensions. Big shift of responsibility from families, local government to federal. Financed by wage payroll tax, though benefits started later. Initially excluded many workers, domestic, farm laborers, public workers, though later amended.
But FDR's New Deal faced huge opposition, not just politically, but from the Supreme Court.
Yes, intense conflict with the court. Sources mention Black Friday, May 27, 1935. Courts struck down key parts of the NIRA, Schechter poultry case, improper delegation of power, interfered with intrastate business. January 36, U.S. v. Butler killed the AAA payments to farmers invaded state power. May 36, a coal act invalidated mining was local activity. The sources say the court effectively paralyzed FDR and Congress's ability to fight the Depression. Some decisions were bare majorities. Critics accused the court of legislating by judicial decree.
FDR famously tried to fight back with his court-packing plan.
That plan failed in Congress, but sources suggest it had a beneficial result, helped restore balance between branches. After that, FDR consulted more with congressional leaders.
One legislative win, despite challenges, was the National Housing Act.
Wagner-Steagall Act, 1937. Senator Wagner tried for years. House defeated it. Chairman Steagall called it reckless, socialist. Sources say FDR personally persuaded Steagall to let it go to vote. It passed. Created U.S. Housing Authority, $500 loans for low-cost housing, funded over 500 buildings, 161K apartments by 1941.
Amidst the Depression, the sources also mention investigations into perceived threats, like the Dies Committee.
Started summer 1938, investigated communist infiltration. Sources note it ignored fascism. Witnesses made unsubstantiated accusations. Accused rarely got rebuttal. Cited hundreds of organizations, papers, unions. Its run was extended yearly due to public concern. Renamed House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, in 1945.
As the U.S. dealt with the Depression, the world situation worsened, pushing towards World War II.
U.S. feeling, described here, was isolationist. Stay out, focus on recovery, follow that not-seeking monsters idea. Electorate opposed war, entanglement.
But September 1939 changed everything.
Hitler invaded Poland, Sep. 3rd. Britain, France declared war Sep. 3rd. Stalin attacked Poland, then Finland. FDR saw the danger, called a special session Sep. 39, asked repeal of the arms embargo, Neutrality Act 1937. Congress passed Neutrality Act 1939, allowed cash and carry arms purchases by belligerents, pay cash, transport it themselves.
The 1940 election happened right in this crisis.
FDR accepted a third-term nomination, broke Washington's tradition, but popular, unopposed in party, chose Henry Wallace VP, Republican Wendell Willkie. Initially, little policy difference. Willkie started accusing FDR of leading U.S. to war. FDR assured Americans no foreign wars for them.
Meanwhile, tensions with Japan were escalating dramatically.
U.S. warned Japan July 1941, renounced 1911 commercial treaty, halted steel scrap iron shipments, except to Britain, aimed right at Japan, deeply resented. Militarists like General Tojo saw it as hostile. Japan needed U.S. resources. Negotiations failed. Japan offered concessions. U.S. demanded more. Japan out of China unacceptable. Japan insisted U.S. stop aid to Chiang Kai-shek. Hull refused. Diplomacy broke down.
And then came the attack that brought the U.S. into the war.
December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. U.S. declared war on Japan December 8th. Germany, Italy declared war on U.S. December 11. U.S. declared war back on them.
The nation mobilized for war on an incredible scale, as the sources describe.
Widespread feeling this war was justified. Right fighting evil of Nazism, fascism, militarism for freedom. Young men enlisted eagerly. Selective service registered 31 million men, 10 million inducted. Women's Army Auxiliary Corps Act, May 42, created non-combatant roles. 350,000 women served, WAACs, waves, etc. Total over 15 million served, largest mobilization ever. Tragically high casualties resulted.
And the economic mobilization was equally massive.
Numerous agencies created: War Production Board, Office of Production Management, Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, price controls, rationing, Offices of Economic Stabilization, censorship, war information, strategic services.
American industry produced staggering amounts.
Amazing output, sources say, driven by credit, demand, efficient organization. Figures given: 75K tanks, 275K aircraft, 650K artillery pieces, 55 million plus tons merchant shipping, managed efficiently. OSRD success noted: American scientists with British invented radar, crucial tech.
In the Pacific, Japan had major early successes.
First 6 months, seized Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, Philippines, etc. MacArthur escaped Philippines but vowed, "I shall return." Japan controlled the Western Pacific.
But the tide turned in the Pacific.
Sources identify the Battle of Midway as the turning point, first major defeat of Japanese naval forces.
In Europe, the Allies adopted a policy of unconditional surrender.
At Casablanca Conference, Jan 43, Roosevelt, Churchill agreed on this for Germany. Pursued via invasion of Italy, then the massive D-Day invasion of France, June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord, Eisenhower commanding.
The scale was immense.
Greatest amphibious landing operation ever. 176,000 Allied troops, thousands of craft, warships, planes crossed the Channel to Normandy. Weeks of heavy fighting against stiff German defense. Allies broke through, liberated Paris, Aug. 25, pushed a Siegfried Line, crossed the Rhine, March 45.
The end in Europe came quickly in spring 1945.
Allies drove across Europe. Germany hit by air raids. Yalta Conference, Feb 45. FDR, Churchill, Stalin, planned post-war Europe, Germany. FDR died April 45. Truman became president. Soviets assaulted Berlin. Churchill wanted Allies to take Berlin. Eisenhower refused for military reasons. Prevent German escape south, not worth lives. Berlin fell to Russians May 2. Hitler's suicide. German surrender May 78.
And the Pacific War ended shortly after that.
Sources state it ended with atomic bombs on Hiroshima, Aug. 6, 45, Nagasaki, Aug. 9. Japan accepted unconditional surrender Aug. 14th, allowed to keep emperor subject to MacArthur. End of what sources call one of the most destructive wars in world history.
Emerging from that global catastrophe, your sources move us into new tensions, the Cold War, and new battles for civil rights at home.
Right. As the sources note, Truman, in his first address, promised to defend FDR's ideals and the Hitler threat. Mussolini, Hitler dead. But a new danger emerged. Communism, fear intensified, shaped policy for decades.
Post-war politics were complex, like the surprising 1948 election.
Truman won that stunning victory over Dewey, defying polls. Sources give reasons. Taft-Hartley Act angered labor, hurting Republicans. Truman courted farm vote, price supports. A leftist revolt showed Truman wasn't soft on communism. A Southern revolt, while meant to hurt him, showed Democrats weren't totally racist, offered hope for civil rights, plus peace, prosperity, and Republicans seen as complacent. There's that quote from Lyndon Johnson about the later Civil Rights Act of 57. "Once you break the virginity, it'll be easier next time," hinting how hard even getting started was.
Then came the Eisenhower years in the 50s.
Sources call his philosophy liberal on human issues, conservative on economic ones. Cooperated with Democrats on moderate things. Social Security Act, 1954, added workers, upped benefits. Wiley-Dondero Bill, 1954, authorized St. Lawrence Seaway with Canada, done 59.
The Cold War dominated Eisenhower's foreign policy.
Visited Korea after taking office, helped get the truce July 53. Armistice at 38th parallel. Communist threat remained Soviet suppression in East Berlin, Hungary. Defense budget raised significantly, Eisenhower's idea. Rise of the military-industrial complex he warned about. Eisenhower doctrine authorized aid to Middle East against communism. Castro took Cuba 59 threat 90 miles away. H-bomb developed by U.S. Soviets' fears of global destruction.
Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was gaining serious momentum at home.
Sources say Congress couldn't ignore the rising indignation of the electorate anymore over inaction,
Leading to the first civil rights bill since Reconstruction.
Civil Rights Act of 1957, described here as a very weak bill, though, created Civil Rights Division, DOJ, Commission on Civil Rights, allowed AG to seek injunctions against voting rights obstruction, tried by a jury, proved useless for years. Discrimination continued, all-white juries acquitted registrars, no real increase in black voters. But sources stress it broke the legislative barrier, showed Congress could act.
There were also direct clashes over desegregation.
Sources mention James Meredith trying to enroll at Ole Miss 1962. Governor Ross Barnett tried to stop him. Rioting ensued. President Kennedy sent federal troops to restore order, ensure Meredith enrolled.
And nonviolent protest became a key strategy.
Sources highlight Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and SCLC. Demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, April 63. Birmingham was determined to stay segregated. King quoted, "Crack Birmingham, crack the South. Police Commissioner Bull Connor used force clubs, attacked dogs. Around 2,000 African Americans arrested, jailed."
Moving into the 60s, the sources show major civil rights laws passed, LBJ's Great Society, but Vietnam casting a huge shadow.
After Kennedy's assassination, November 63, Congress acted quickly on some measures, partly to honor him. Clean Air Act of 63 passed.
A huge legislative win was the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Described here as a major achievement. Forbade race discrimination in most public accommodations, hotels, restaurants. Authorized AG to sue to desegregate public facilities, schools. Banned race-sex discrimination by employers' unions. Created EEOC. Prohibited discrimination in federal fund use. Created Community Relations Service. Southerners filibustered 2.5+ months, ended by cloture vote, needed 23rds then.
Lyndon Johnson pushed hard for his Great Society agenda.
Used his skills, big Democratic majorities, appealed to Congress to improve lives. Key programs, Medicare, elderly via Social Security, and Medicaid, needy, enacted July 65. Education Act, April 65, $1 3B, aid public parochial schools. Higher Education Act, 650-meter scholarships, seen as major successes.
But Vietnam increasingly overshadowed everything.
Opposition grew students, Berkeley protests, draft card burning. Pentagon told LBJ needed 500K troops minimum. War spending fueled inflation. Civil rights riots continued. Atlanta, Chicago, Cleveland, NY. Campus demos disruptive. Worst of all, sources say, increased numbers of Americans killed and wounded reported daily. Speaker Carl Albert quoted, "That broke the back of the Great Society right there. Money went to the unpopular war."
Nixon's presidency saw efforts to end Vietnam, but he also expanded it.
Authorized invasion of Cambodian border sanctuaries, April 70. Congress repealed Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Dvork 70. Nixon signed Jan 71. That resolution gave presidents broad war power.
Expanding into Cambodia caused more protests, tragic events.
More campus demos. Kent State, Ohio, May 74 students killed by National Guard. Sources note the picture of the terrified, screaming young woman over a body deeply affected people. Days later, 2 students killed by state police at Jackson State, Mississippi.
The Pentagon Papers leak further damaged public trust.
NYT published them July 70. Classified docs on Vietnam decisions, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. Sources say it further eroded confidence and made the Nixon administration extremely paranoid about leaks, leading to more secrecy, spying on citizens.
Despite that, Nixon had a major foreign policy success.
Historic visit to Communist China, Feb 72. Agreed communique for more interaction. Sources say only a well-known anti-communist like Nixon could have done it politically.
Vietnam finally ended during Nixon's second term.
Paris Agreement, Jan 73, North-South Vietnam, U.S. Viet Cong. But the fragile South Vietnamese government soon collapsed. Country overrun by North. Americans evacuated from Saigon by helicopter, April 75. Sources call it a soul-searing defeat. Domino effect didn't happen, lesson should have been. Not need to be relearned, but wasn't, suggesting later failures.
After Vietnam, Congress tried to reclaim authority over war powers.
Resented presidents starting wars without them? Passed War Powers Resolution 1973. Required consulting Congress before troops and hostilities. Terminates engagement in 60 days unless Congress acts. Nixon vetoed. Congress overrode November 73. Became law. But sources note it's been regularly ignored or bypassed since.
And then came the scandal that defined the mid-70s, Watergate.
Early 73, Senate created committee, Sam Ervin Jr., to investigate 72 campaign break-in. Televised hearings riveted the nation. John Dean revealed Nixon part of cover-up. Alexander Butterfield revealed Nixon taped Oval Office talks in '71. Nixon claimed, "I am not a crook," but sources say tapes proved otherwise. Committee learned of enemies lists, plumbers unit, wiretap.
The investigation moved to the House, leading to a fight over the tapes.
House Judiciary Committee, Peter Rodino chair. Grand jury indicted 7 aides. Evidence sent to judiciary. Sealed report cited Nixon as unindicted co-conspirator.
Both the committee and a special prosecutor wanted the tapes.
They subpoenaed them. Special prosecutor Jaworski subpoenaed 64 tapes. Nixon refused. Released edited transcripts. Rejected. Nixon wrote Rodino he wouldn't make executive henceforth, subservient to the legislative branch. Supreme Court forced release.
The political fallout was huge.
VP Spiro Agnew resigned October '73. Bribery tax charges from Maryland GovTime. Nixon appointed Gerald Ford VP, 25th Amendment, Congress confirmed. Nixon resigned Aug 74 facing impeachment removal. Ford became president. First-time president VP reached office without popular election.
Ford's pardon of Nixon was hugely controversial.
Sep 74, full pardon, shock, anger. Ford denied a deal, claimed wanted to end controversy, heal nation. Speed, lack of preparation fueled corrupt bargain talk. Ford paid price in '76 election. By his death, 2006, sources say many accepted his claim nation needed healing.
The 70s and early 80s also had ongoing economic woes and more corruption scandals.
Inflation stayed bad. 1979, oil price spike, CPI hit 18%, gas over an egg gallon, Fed raised prime rate to 20% to slow loans, discouraged installment buying.
And the FBI's abscam sting caught members of Congress taking bribes.
FBI agents posed as Arab businessmen, offered bribes, videotaped congressmen. Members indicted guilty 1981, resignations defeats. Michael Myers, PA Dem, first member expelled from House since 1861, bribery. Carter brother investigating cleared, peanut business.
President Carter's foreign policy had highs and lows.
Former relations with People's Republic of China, 1979, withdrew Taiwan recognition, renounced defense treaty. Notable achievement, Israel-Egypt peace treaty, nations at war since '73, Carter pressured, Sadat begin visits failed. Carter invited to Camp David Sep 78, mediated 13 days, reached framework for peace. Sadat began Nobel Peace Prize 78. Formal treaty signed Washington March 79.
But he also faced major crises, like the Iran hostage crisis.
Iran Revolution 79, Shah fled, Khomeini took power. Shah admitted to U.S. for treatment. Iranians seized U.S. embassy November 79, 53 Americans, 444 days. Seen as hostility to U.S., Great Satan. Khomeini held hostages until Carter left office, Yan 81.
And the Cold War heated up again with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Dissent, 1979. U.S. saw it as expansionism. Cold War escalated. Carter withdrew U.S. from 1980 Moscow Olympics. Halted grain sales, increased defense spending, supported Afghan rebels, Mujahideen. Sources note Iran-Iraq War, 1980s, allowed Saddam Hussein to gain power.
This leads us to the conservative turn, the Reagan era, and into the recent history covered by your sources, end of the Cold War, new global challenges.
Reagan won presidency 1980 against Carter. Sources say Democrats demoralized about fighting budget cuts, military increase. Californians saw Reagan as all bark and no bite. Increased spending taxes there.
The sources describe Reagan's presidential style.
Not into legislative details, but born political infighter. Pleaded with Congress, buttonholed them, worked through staff. Savvy team of congressional liaison men. Used TV skillfully, Tip O'Neill quoted. Reagan Team 81, probably the best run political operating unit I've ever seen.
Reaganomics meant big changes in tax and budget policy.
Major tax cuts, rates cut high-low, corporate cut, capital gains reduced, estate gift exclusions up. Budget cuts, education, health, housing, environment, food stamps, culture, urban aid slashed. Military budget boosted, 180 tons to 279 BZ, Navy rebuild, bombers, missiles, Star Wars. Deficit soared, 79 BZs at $290, national debt tripled. Reagan eventually asked Congress to raise taxes.
A major scandal was the Iran-Contra affair, exposed late '86.
Illegal arms sales to Iran for hostages. Funds diverted to Contras in Nicaragua. Congress banned funding. Reagan accepted responsibility, said sent aid for relations, not hostages. Aides denied telling him about Contra funds. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh investigated. 14 indicted, all convicted initially, but North Poindexter convictions overturned on appeal. Poindexter resigned, North fired. North convicted 3 felonies, destroying falsifying docs, acquitted 9. Judge later overturned dismissed charges. McFarlane pleaded guilty withholding evidence. Bush leader pardoned McFarlane, others.
Reagan also faced other foreign policy challenges.
Sent troops to Lebanon, 83. Peacekeeping. Failed. Suicide bomber hit Marine barracks, October 83, killed 241 servicemen. Reagan withdrew troops. Suffered no political ill effects, sources say. Teflon president, nothing stuck.
A defining global event concluding then was the Cold War's end.
Gorbachev in USSR, glasnost, perestroika, arms control treaties, Reagan visited Moscow, Berlin Wall fell, now 89 symbolic end, Soviet Union dissolved, Dec 91, Cold War over.
George H.W. Bush's presidency saw the first big post-Cold War conflict, the Persian Gulf War.
August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Bush condemned, built international coalition, UN resolution, Operation Desert Shield, deploy troops, Operation Desert Storm, Jan 91 aerial, February 91 ground, drove Iraq from Kuwait in 100 hours. Coalition decided against invading Iraq proper to oust Hussein, judge dicey, not worth the risk. Sources call this a wise decision, one that unfortunately went unheeded a decade later. Foreshadowing.
Moving into the 90s, the sources mention a shift toward a kinder and gentler country.
Americans with Disabilities Act, July 90, prohibited discrimination. Bush appointed Clarence Thomas, African-American, to Supreme Court, replaced Marshall. Televised hearings, controversial. Anita Hill allegations, ability, conservative views. Senate confirmed narrowly, 52-48.
Then came the Clinton years, starting in 92.
Clinton won against Bush-Perot. Bush seen as out of touch with recession. Early blunder. Appointed wife Hillary to head healthcare task force. Plan announced, unbelievably complicated, 1,300 plus pages. Assigned to 3 House committees. None produced acceptable bill. Republicans condemned. Bill died.
The 90s also had violence and corruption in the news.
Oklahoma City bombing, 95 federal building, 169 lives lost by Americans. Showed angry armed individuals with contempt for government. Perpetrators caught, tried, punished. Other scandals, Sentpak would resign, sexual harassment, congressional post office embezzlement.
Politically, 1994 was a huge shift to the Republican Revolution.
Republicans took House Senate, first time since 54 House, 86 Senate, gained governorships, campaigned on contract with America. Most items passed House, except term limits, missile defense, few passed Senate.
House Speaker Newt Gingrich pushed hard for a balanced budget.
Warren needed by 2002. House Budget Committee bill trimmed dollar spending, cut programs cabinets. Leon Panetta quoted accusing Gingrich holding gun to Clinton's head, threatening shutdown, cuts helping rich hurting poor needy. Clinton encouraged Dems to blast GOP cuts. Clinton shifted centrist, seemed open to compromise, agreed to welfare reform, cut grants require work. Clinton quoted, "The era of big government is over."
These budget fights led to government shutdowns.
Late 95, early 96. Federal employees locked out, Congress members faced angry constituents, returned Jan 96, realized GOP revolution in trouble. Robert Dole. Enough is enough. Gingrich capitulated, ended shutdown. Bills passed reopening governor. Clinton clearly won battle. Conservatives resented Gingrich.
Clinton was reelected in 96.
Beat Dole, Perot. Booming economy, falling deficits, centrism helped. Dole's votes mainly South Mountain West.
His foreign policy sometimes described as unsteady.
Sent troops to Somalia, peacekeeping, withdrew after casualties, brokered Israel-Palestinian deal, self-rule Gaza West Bank, but efforts failed due to extremist violence.
Beyond politics, the sources highlight huge changes in technology and society, late 20th century.
Personal computer, IBM 60s, microchip 1971, monumental importance, made it possible to create and organize store info on smaller machines, data word processing.
Social change was profound too, especially family structure.
Sources describe disintegration of traditional family, 2 parents, 1 working on home, later marriages, divorce commonplace, every other marriage, more kids born to single moms, every 4th child missing father, often near poverty, emotional psychological scars incalculable, increased youth crime, urban areas.
Immigration kept changing the country's makeup.
Growing number of Latinos, thousands illegally cross Mexican border, low-paying farm work, from various Latin American countries. Settled Southwest, TX to CA. Early 21st century, Latinos large percent population there. Over 13 CAZTX, nearly 12 NM. Puerto Ricans in East, Cuban refugees Miami, English second language trend, anti-immigration sentiment legals. Immigration Reform and Control Act 1986, penalized employers' amnesty. Problem worsened, border not adequately policed. Mexican consul quoted, "For every foot of..."
Finally, your sources bring us into the 21st century with 9/11 and the wars that followed.
September 11, 2001, hijacked planes hit World Trade Center, Pentagon. Bush seemed dazed, then rallied nation. Called to end terrorism, vanquish al-Qaeda, capture bin Laden dead or alive. Congress quickly passed resolution, gave Bush sweeping powers to use force against those responsible.
Which led to attacking Afghanistan.
U.S., with others, attacked October 2001. Toppled Taliban in 6 months, knocked out al-Qaeda ops. Bin Laden leaders escaped, Pakistan, Afghanistan. By 2008, sources say bin Laden's symbolic al-Qaeda network back operating.
And the sources describe the 2003 Iraq invasion as a very significant decision.
March 2003 invasion described here as one of the most disastrous foreign policy mistakes ever committed. Reasons cited. Relatively small high-tech force used, no plans for occupation after, no plans for withdrawal.
The war itself went fast initially.
Coalition formed, U.S. British mainly, swept north, overwhelmed Iraqi army, Hussein disappeared, cities captured, but looting started immediately. Nearly total breakdown, essential services, water, electricity. Iraq headed towards civil war, Sunni versus Shiite.
And the sources mention Bush's mission accomplished speech shortly after the invasion.
May 1st, 2003. Bush flew to carrier Abraham Lincoln. Stood under banner, announced end of major combat ops to cheering audience.
And that brings us right up to the end of the historical period covered in the material you provided. We've really journeyed through an immense sweep of time from the earliest history right through global conflicts, huge social changes, and into the early 2000s.
Yeah, and our goal, just to reiterate, was to be your guides through your source material, pulling out the key insights, the stories, the connections that emerge directly from this text you shared with us.
So why does looking at this long history, as it's presented right here in these sources, why does it matter to you, the listener, today?
Well, as we've seen, certain themes, certain tensions just keep popping up, don't they?
They really do.
Yep.
That constant push and pull between federal and state power, the ongoing debates about immigration, national identity, questions about the government's role in society, the economy.
Right. And the long, often really difficult arc of civil rights struggles. Plus, the complex, often unintended consequences of America's actions, both here at home and, out on the world stage. This deep dive, based purely on your sources, it shows us a nation built on, bold expansion and this stated desire for freedom and opportunity, but also one that's repeatedly grappling with intense internal divisions, economic shocks, and the complicated aftermath of its choices, internally and globally. So the question for you to think about is, what does this long history of striving, struggle, and change, as told right here in these sources, tell you about the challenges and opportunities the nation faces right now?